The Galactic Academy had seen countless trials over the decades, but none were as infamous as the survival test on Xylaris 3. Known across the galaxies for its unforgiving terrain and relentless heat, the desert planet was the ultimate proving ground for those aspiring to join the elite ranks of interstellar explorers. The chosen cadets, representing the most advanced and resilient species, had trained for months in preparation for this challenge. Among them was Meera, a human cadet from Earth who stepped off the shuttle with a sense of quiet determination. Xylaris 3 stretched out before them, a vast, shimmering expanse of ochre dunes under a blindingly bright sky. The air was thick with heat, warping the horizon into a flickering mirage. Meera took a deep breath, adjusting the strap of her backpack, which was considerably smaller and less advanced compared to the ones carried by her fellow cadets. She could feel the sun's searing intensity pressing down on her shoulders, but instead of panicking, she squinted into the distance, assessing the terrain. To her right, a group of Gorgon cadets were assembling their hydration units, metallic spheres with retractable antennae designed to extract moisture from the air. The Gorgons were a towering, muscular species with skin as tough as bark, adapted for extreme climates. One of them, a particularly imposing male named Zarok, scoffed when he noticed Meera's simple equipment. "Is that all you brought, human?" he rumbled, his voice a deep growl. Meera glanced at her pickaxe, the metal bucket clipped to her belt, and the coil of rope slung over her shoulder. She nodded, unbothered by his derision. Further along the sandy ridge, a group of sleek, silver-skinned Venarians were setting up reflective shelters, using their holographic devices to create shaded microclimates. The Venarians were known for their adaptability and their reliance on technology, but already Meera could see the devices flickering, struggling against the planet's magnetic interference. A few meters away, the Lurksians, Fulane-like aliens with retractable claws and hypersensitive whiskers, were digging shallow pits, attempting to find cooler ground beneath the surface. Meera knew that while the Lurksians were agile and adept hunters, their sleek fur coats would work against them in this relentless heat. The lead instructor, a stern-faced Martokian named Veth, called the group to attention. He stood atop a rocky outcrop, his armor glinting despite being dulled by sand. "Listen carefully," he announced, his voice booming across the dunes. "Your mission is to survive for 3 full rotations of Xylaris 3. You will receive no external assistance. Your survival skills will be tested as well as your ingenuity. Use your equipment wisely and remember, the desert shows no mercy." His eyes swept across the assembled cadets, lingering on Meera for just a moment longer than the others, as if assessing her chances. Meera felt a pang of uncertainty under his gaze but quickly pushed it aside. She knew the challenges that awaited her. Growing up in a rural part of Earth, she had spent summers digging wells with her father, learning to read the land and listen for the subtle signs of underground water. The desert did not intimidate her. It felt familiar, almost welcoming. The instructor raised his arm, signaling the start. The cadets dispersed immediately, each group heading in a different direction. Zarok and his Gorgon team stomped confidently toward the distant red dunes, convinced that sheer endurance would see them through. The Venarians moved with graceful efficiency, setting up solar beacons to maintain contact, while the Lurksians opted for a stealthier approach, scanning the landscape for signs of movement. Meera remained still for a moment, her instincts telling her to conserve energy. She scanned the ground carefully, looking for the faint traces of plant life, any sign that moisture might lie beneath the surface. A few withered shrubs caught her attention. A good start. She knelt beside one, examining the soil, dry and cracked, but not entirely lifeless. A good sign. The first hours passed with the sun climbing mercilessly higher. Meera's dark hair was soaked with sweat, her skin reddening despite the lightweight fabric of her clothes. She heard cursing from the Gorgon group. One of their hydration units had jammed. Nearby, the Venarians' holographic shades flickered and collapsed, unable to hold up against the electromagnetic interference. The Lurksians, meanwhile, were digging furiously, their claws kicking up dust, but they seemed to be having little luck. Meera wiped her forehead and began to dig, using her pickaxe to break the hardened crust of the earth. Her movements were steady, rhythmic, each strike calculated. She knew the importance of pace, Exhaustion could kill faster than dehydration. After a few hours of relentless digging, her arms ached and her hands were raw. She paused, wiping her palms on her trousers, and took a sip from her small water flask. She had rationed carefully, but it was already half empty. A sudden shadow fell across her, and Meera looked up to see Zarok looming over her, his broad silhouette blocking out the sun. He sneered, shaking his head. "Still at it, human. You're wasting your energy. You'll dig yourself to death." Meera didn't respond. Instead, she kept her focus on the task, striking the ground once more. Zarok muttered something to his teammates and stomped off, dismissing her efforts as futile. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows over the desert. Meera finally hit something softer, sand mixed with clay. Her heart pounded with renewed hope. Carefully, she dug around the area, widening the hole. A faint dampness clung to the soil. She pressed her palm against it and felt a slight, cool moisture. Encouraged, she quickened her pace, working through the pain in her hands and shoulders. By the time dusk settled, Meera had carved out a shallow pit, and a small trickle of muddy water began to seep up from the bottom. She took a cloth from her pack, soaked it, and squeezed a few drops into her mouth. Relief washed over her. As the stars emerged, the temperature dropped, and the other cadets trudged back to the central campsite, their faces drawn with exhaustion. Meera stayed by her hole, determined to make it deeper. A few of the Venerians glanced in her direction, curious, but kept their distance. Zarok, seeing Meera's persistence, muttered something derogatory under his breath, but Meera ignored him. She knew that the real challenge would begin when the heat returned in the morning. For now, she would rest, but her mind remained focused on one thought. If there was even a small chance of water below, she had to dig deeper. The survival of the next few days depended on it. Meera woke to the first rays of the Xylaris 3 sun piercing through the thin atmosphere, casting the desert in a blinding golden hue. The temperature had dropped sharply during the night, and the air was now frigid. Meera's muscles ached from the relentless digging, her hands raw and blistered. Her pit was no deeper than her knees, and the water that had seeped in during the night was barely enough to wet her palm. Yet it was something. Proof that she was on the right track. She unwrapped a piece of cloth she had kept tucked beneath her shirt to prevent it from freezing in the night. Dipping it into the murky water, she wrung out a few precious drops and let them trickle down her throat. The taste was gritty, the water thick with sediment, but it was enough to wet her parched lips. The rest of the cadets had gathered at the base camp, a shallow depression in the sand where the instructor had set up a temporary beacon. From her vantage point atop the slight ridge, Meera could hear snippets of conversation, sharp with frustration and tinged with desperation. Zarok's booming voice rose above the others, his tone a mix of irritation and arrogance. "This is ridiculous," he growled, kicking the malfunctioning hydration unit in front of him. The metal sphere clanked across the sand, its antennae bent and useless. "These were supposed to be top-grade military models. What kind of test is this? How are we supposed to survive without functioning equipment?" A Venerian cadet named Solari crouched beside her own broken purifier, her silver skin glistening with a thin sheen of sweat. She glanced at Zarok, her violet eyes narrowing. "You think you're the only one struggling? My unit overheated an hour ago. There's nothing left." "Then we demand a recall," Zarok snapped, his fists clenching. "This test is rigged. How are we supposed to find water out here?" Meera watched them from her post, her eyes scanning the horizon. Beyond the base camp, the dunes stretched endlessly, the sand shifting like a living entity under the intense heat. The cadets had scattered in small groups, each team searching for any sign of moisture, any indication of a water source. Yet all returned empty-handed, their faces drawn and haggard. Zarok noticed Meera standing alone atop the ridge, her pickaxe in hand. His dark eyes narrowed, a sneer forming on his lips. "Hey, human!" he called out, his voice echoing through the camp. "Still digging your little hole? Think you'll strike oil?" Laughter erupted from the other cadets, some chuckling nervously, others too weary to join in. Meera met Zarok's gaze without flinching. "Better than sitting around waiting for a miracle," she said evenly, her voice carrying despite its softness. Zarok's jaw tightened, the muscles along his neck flexing. He took a step toward her, his massive frame casting a shadow that loomed over her. "You think you're better than us? Just because you're used to scraping in the dirt back on Earth?" Meera didn't respond. She simply turned away and resumed digging, her pickaxe striking the compacted ground with a steady, rhythmic beat. The others watched her for a moment longer before dispersing, their eyes darting back and forth across the barren landscape. Meera focused on her work, blocking out the murmurs of doubt and scorn. Her hands trembled with exhaustion, each swing sending jolts of pain up her arms. Sweat dripped down her brow, stinging her eyes, but she kept going. She had to dig deeper. She had felt the dampness beneath the surface, and she knew she was close. An hour passed. The sun climbed higher, baking the sand until it shimmered like molten glass. Meera's shirt clung to her back, soaked through with sweat. Her lips were cracked, her throat dry. She reached into her pack and pulled out the last of her water, a small, half-filled canteen. The liquid inside was warm, almost hot, but she sipped it slowly, savoring each drop. Suddenly, a shadow fell across her. Meera looked up, squinting against the glare. Zarok loomed over her, his arms crossed over his broad chest. His expression was a mixture of contempt and curiosity. "You're wasting your time," he said flatly. "There's no water here. You're digging your own grave." Meera met his gaze, her jaw set. "Maybe, or maybe you're just not looking hard enough." Zarok scoffed, his lip curling. "You're stubborn, I'll give you that, but stubbornness won't keep you alive." He gestured to the hole, the shallow pit she had been working on since the night before. "What do you think you'll find? A secret reservoir? A hidden lake?" Meera tightened her grip on the pickaxe, her knuckles white. "If you're not going to help, then leave." For a moment, Zarok said nothing. His dark eyes flicked from the hole to Meera's blistered hands, his expression unreadable. Then he turned away with a grunt, muttering under his breath as he trudged back toward the base camp. Meera watched him go, her shoulders sagging. She could feel the weight of exhaustion settling into her bones, her muscles aching with each breath. But she couldn't stop. Not yet. Not when she was so close. She resumed digging, her strokes slower now, more deliberate. The ground grew softer, the sand giving way to packed earth. Meera's heart quickened. The air smelled different, heavier, like wet stone. Her pickaxe struck something harder, something that echoed beneath the surface. Meera dropped to her knees, brushing the sand away with her hands. Beneath the compacted earth, she found a layer of clay, cool and damp to the touch. Hope surged through her, a sudden burst of adrenaline banishing the ache in her limbs. Meera grabbed her bucket, her fingers trembling as she scraped at the clay, pulling it away in chunks. The ground was wet, the moisture seeping through the surface. Meera pressed her palm against it, feeling the cool, life-giving dampness spreading beneath her fingertips. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. She needed to dig deeper, widen the hole, let the water rise to the surface. With renewed determination, Meera set to work, her pickaxe striking the ground with rhythmic, relentless force. From the base camp, Zarok watched her, his jaw clenched. The Gorgon cadet's own hydration unit lay in pieces at his feet, the internal mechanisms fried beyond repair. His teammates sat in the shade, their expressions drawn and hollow, eyes fixed on the horizon where no relief could be seen. Zarok's gaze drifted back to Meera, the human girl who refused to give up, the girl who kept digging despite the heat, the blisters, the exhaustion. Something about her persistence gnawed at him, a feeling he couldn't shake. A memory surfaced, unbidden, the sight of his father digging irrigation trenches back on Gorgon Prime. The old man's back bent, but unbroken, his hands scarred and bloodied, but unyielding. Zarok shook his head, dispelling the memory. This wasn't Gorgon Prime, and Meera Crane was no Gorgon. She was just a stubborn, foolish human with a rusty pickaxe and an impossible dream. And yet, as he watched her dig, sweat glistening on her brow, he couldn't help but wonder. What if she was right? Meera kept digging, her breaths coming in short, ragged gasps. The sun beat down, relentless and merciless, but she refused to stop. Her hands bled, her muscles screamed, but she kept going, and as she struck the ground one last time, the earth beneath her shuddered, and a small, muddy trickle of water seeped through the cracked clay, spreading slowly across the bottom of the pit. Meera dropped to her knees, tears stinging her eyes as she cupped her hands, gathering the precious, life-saving water. The taste was bitter, gritty with sediment, but it was cool and wet, and at that moment it was the most beautiful thing she had ever tasted. Farther down the ridge, Zarok's eyes widened as he saw her lift her hands to her mouth, water dripping from her palms. The other cadets turned to look, their faces a mix of shock and disbelief. Meera Crane, the human girl they had laughed at, had found water in the desert, and as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the sand, Zarok knew that nothing on Xylus 3 would ever be the same again. Meera sat by the edge of the pit she had spent hours digging, her eyes fixed on the shallow pool of murky water that had slowly begun to collect at the bottom. The small, muddy trickle was far from the abundant wellspring she had imagined, but it was something. With blistered hands, she dipped the metal bucket into the puddle, scooping up as much water as she could. The sediment swirled in the bucket, thick and dark, but the water was cool against her cracked lips. She took a cautious sip, the grit scraping her throat as she swallowed. The taste was metallic, almost bitter, but she forced herself to drink. Every drop was precious. Every drop was survival. The camp below had descended into chaos. The Gorgan cadets were arguing amongst themselves, their voices echoing across the desert. Zarok stood at the center, his chest heaving with frustration as he paced back and forth, the sand kicking up in clouds around his massive boots. His hydration unit lay in pieces at his feet, the once shiny metal now a twisted, charred mass. "You said it was unbreakable!" Zarok roared, grabbing one of the smaller Gorgon cadets by the collar. The smaller cadet, a wiry male with a nervous twitch, raised his hands defensively. "It was supposed to be," he stammered, his voice trembling. "The instructors said it was top-tier equipment. I don't know what happened." "What happened?" Zarok snarled, shoving the cadet backward. "What happened is we're stranded in the middle of a desert with no water and useless junk for supplies." A few meters away, the Venerians were huddled beneath the crumpled remains of their reflective shelter, their silver skin glistening with sweat. Solari was crouched beside her broken purifier, her violet eyes glazed and unfocused. The device lay open, its internal mechanisms fried and smoking. She pressed a shaky hand to her forehead, her skin hot and clammy. "We need to find water," Solari muttered, her voice weak. "We can't last another day in this heat." One of her teammates, a tall, slender Venerian male with sunken cheeks, glanced nervously toward the ridge where Meera continued to dig. Maybe the human was onto something," he whispered. Solari's eyes flicked to the ridge, her expression tight with exhaustion. "What? You think she actually found water up there?" "She's been digging since last night," the male said. "What if she's right?" Solari shook her head, her jaw clenching. "No, it's impossible. There's no water here. The instructors said so." But despite her words, her gaze lingered on Meera's silhouette, a tiny figure against the vast expanse of sand, her pickaxe glinting in the harsh sun. Meera wiped her brow with the back of her hand, her arms trembling with exhaustion. The hole was deeper now, the sides reinforced with stones she had dug up in the process. The water was rising, slowly but steadily, and she knew she needed to expand the pit further if she wanted to collect enough to sustain herself. Her muscles ached, her skin was raw and blistered, but she kept going, the rhythmic sound of the pickaxe striking the ground echoing through the silence. The air was heavy with heat, each breath feeling like inhaling fire. Footsteps approached. Meera didn't look up. "Still at it?" Zarok's voice rumbled, low and hostile. He loomed over her, his shadow stretching long and dark across the sand. His face was flushed, his eyes bloodshot, his jaw clenched tight. Sweat dripped down his temples, soaking into the collar of his uniform. Meera said nothing, her pickaxe swinging again and again, each strike weaker than the last. The ground was harder now, packed clay mixed with stone, but she refused to stop. "You're wasting your time," Zarok sneered, his lip curling. "There's no water here. You're just digging your own grave." Meera kept her eyes on the ground, her teeth gritted. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of a response. Zarok's fist clenched at his sides, the muscles in his arms flexing. "You think you're so clever, don't you? Digging like a rat while the rest of us are dying of thirst?" Meera swung the pickaxe again, her grip slipping as the metal handle bit into her raw palms. The pain was sharp, a burning sting that shot up her arms, but she kept going, her breaths coming in ragged gasps. "You think you're better than us?" Zarok's voice was closer now, the heat of his breath hot against her ear. "You think you're going to save us all with a rusty bucket and a hole in the ground?" Meera's jaw clenched, her vision blurring as sweat dripped into her eyes. The ground swayed beneath her, the edges of the pit spinning. The world felt too bright, too loud. The sun a blinding white orb that burned through her skull. Suddenly, Zarok's hand shot out, grabbing the pickaxe mid-swing. His grip was iron, his fingers closing around the handle like a vice. Meera's eyes snapped to his, her pulse pounding in her ears. "You're done," Zarok said, his voice deadly calm. "You're going to stop this right now." Meera's chest heaved, her breaths coming in sharp, shallow bursts. She held Zarok's gaze, her jaw set, her eyes fierce despite the exhaustion dragging her down. "I'm not done," she said, her voice low and steady. "Not yet." Zarok's jaw twitched, his nostrils flaring. For a moment the two of them stood there, locked in a silent standoff, the air between them thick with tension. Then, without warning, Zarok released the pickaxe, shoving Meera backward. She stumbled, her feet slipping in the loose sand. The world spun and she fell hard, her back slamming against the ground. The air rushed from her lungs in a harsh gasp, the sky a blur of white and blue above her. Zarok leaned over her, his face inches from hers, his eyes dark and furious. "You're going to get yourself killed," he snarled. "And when you do, don't expect me to save you." Meera's vision swam, the edges of her world going dark. But as she lay there, the taste of mud and blood on her tongue, she heard it, the faint trickling sound of water rising up from the pit. The water was there, beneath the surface, bubbling up like a hidden spring, slow but steady. Meera's eyes fluttered shut, a weak, delirious smile curving her cracked lips. The water was rising. It was there. It was real. And she was going to get it, no matter what. Meera's body ached as she lay sprawled across the hot sand, the world a hazy blur of blue sky and golden dunes. The sun beat down mercilessly, burning through her shirt, scorching her exposed skin. The metallic taste of blood lingered on her tongue from the fall, her head throbbing with each shallow breath. The ground beneath her vibrated faintly, the trickling sound of water echoing through the pit she had spent hours digging. The sound stirred her, pulling her back from the brink of unconsciousness. She forced her eyes open, blinking against the blinding sunlight. Above her the ridge loomed, and beyond it the base camp where Zarok and the others had gathered in frustrated, helpless clusters. Meera clenched her fists, her raw palms stinging as grains of sand dug into her open blisters. Slowly, painfully, she rolled onto her side and dragged herself toward the pit. The sound was unmistakable now, a soft, steady trickle, the murmur of water seeping up from the depths. Meera's heart pounded, the hope she had clung to surging through her veins like a shot of adrenaline. With trembling hand, she grabbed the edge of the pit and pulled herself up. Her arms quivered with the effort, but she managed to haul herself over the rim and into the hole. The pit was deeper now, the walls reinforced with stones she had unearthed during the digging. At the bottom, a small pool of water shimmered in the dusty light, the surface rippling gently as more water bubbled up from below. It was no lake, not yet, but it was more than she could have hoped for. Meera reached for her bucket, her fingers shaking as she dipped it into the murky pool. The water was cold against her skin, a blessed contrast to the searing heat of the desert. She pulled the bucket up, her arms straining under the weight of the water, and brought it to her lips. The liquid was thick with silt, gritty against her teeth, but it was cool and wet, and tasted like life itself. Meera drank greedily, gulping down as much as she could before lowering the bucket and filling it again. Footsteps echoed above her, heavy and deliberate. Meera's head snapped up, and her eyes locked onto the massive frame of Zarok, his shadow falling across the pit like a dark, menacing specter. He stood at the edge, his jaw set, his eyes blazing with a mix of fury and disbelief. "So you found water," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You think that changes anything?" Meera met his gaze, her jaw clenched. "It changes everything," she said, her voice hoarse but steady. Zarok's fists clenched at his sides, his muscles bulging beneath his sweat-soaked shirt. "You think you're so smart, don't you? Digging your little hole while the rest of us are dying of thirst." He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "You think you're going to save everyone with this?" Meera swallowed, the cool waters settling in her stomach like a stone. "I never said I was saving anyone," she said, her voice cold. "But you're not going to stop me." Zarok's expression darkened, his fists flexing. For a moment, Meera thought he would leap into the pit and rip the bucket from her hands, but instead he stepped back, his eyes flicking to the pool of water at her feet. "You're not the only one who's thirsty," he said, his voice a low, menacing growl. "Remember that." With that, he turned and stormed off, his heavy boots crunching against the sand as he disappeared over the ridge. Meera watched him go, her chest tight with a combination of fear and anger. She knew Zarok wasn't done with her yet, and she knew that whatever he was planning, it wouldn't be good. Meera lowered herself to the bottom of the pit, her knees sinking into the damp, muddy ground. She dug her fingers into the soft earth, pulling away clumps of clay and rocks, widening the hole. The water continued to seep up, slow but steady, each drop a lifeline in the merciless desert. Above her, the sun sank lower, casting long shadows across the dunes. The temperature began to drop, the blistering heat giving way to a bone-chilling cold. Meera shivered, her wet clothes clinging to her skin. She knew she needed to keep digging, to deepen the pit, to create a reservoir that could hold enough water to sustain her through the coming days. Her muscles screamed in protest as she lifted the pickaxe and brought it down, the metal blade striking the clay with a dull thud. The sound echoed through the pit, a rhythmic, relentless beat that drowned out the whispers of doubt in her mind. Meera kept digging, her hands raw and bleeding, her breaths coming in sharp, ragged bursts. As the sky darkened, the other cadets gathered in the base camp, their faces pale and drawn. Solari sat hunched beside the remains of her broken purifier, her violet eyes hollow and distant. The Venerian cadet who had mocked Meera earlier now watched the ridge, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. "What do you think she's doing up there?" he muttered, his voice tight with anxiety. Solari shook her head, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "I don't know," she said, her voice a whisper. "But if she's found water—" Before she could finish, Zarok returned, his massive frame looming over the group like a storm cloud. His eyes blazed with fury, his jaw clenched so tight that the muscles in his neck bulged beneath his skin. "She's hiding something," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "The human. She found water." Solari's eyes widened, her mouth falling open. "What? How?" "She's digging a pit," Zarok snarled, his fists clenched. "She's been digging all day, and there's water down there." The Venerian cadet leaped to his feet, his eyes flashing. "Then what are we waiting for? Let's go get it!" Zarek's hand shot out, grabbing the cadet by the collar and yanking him back down. "No," he said, his voice deadly calm. "We're not going to get it. Not yet." The cadet's eyes darted between Zarok and the ridge, his throat bobbing as he swallowed. "But we're dying out here. If she has water, she's not going to share it," Zarok said, his voice sharp as a blade. "Not after what I said to her." Solari frowned, her brow furrowing. "What did you say to her?" Zarok's jaw twitched, his eyes darkening. "Enough." He turned away, his gaze fixed on the ridge where Meera continued to dig. "We'll wait until nightfall," he said, his voice a low, rumbling growl. "Then we take what's ours." Meera kept digging, her breaths coming in labored gasps, her hands raw and bleeding. The water continued to rise, inch by inch, the murky pool spreading across the bottom of the pit. But as the sky darkened and the temperature plummeted, a chill ran down her spine. She knew Zarok was coming, and she knew she had to be ready. Meera crouched at the bottom of the pit, her back pressed against the cold, damp earth. The air was still, the silence oppressive. Above her, the night sky stretched out like a dark, endless void, the stars glinting like shards of broken glass. The pit was deeper now, the walls reinforced with stones she had painstakingly placed to prevent the sand from collapsing. The water had risen to her ankles, a murky, sluggish pool that glistened faintly in the pale moonlight. Her body trembled with exhaustion, her muscles knotted with pain. Every inch of her ached, her fingers raw and blistered from hours of relentless digging. But she couldn't stop now, not when she knew what was coming. Footsteps echoed in the distance, heavy and deliberate. Meera's heart pounded against her ribcage, her breasts coming in sharp, shallow bursts. She pressed herself deeper into the shadows, her eyes fixed on the rim of the pit. Zarok appeared first, his massive frame looming against the night sky like a dark, menacing shadow. His jaw was set, his eyes cold and hard as he stared down into the pit. Behind him, Solari and the Venerian cadet lingered, their faces pale and drawn, their eyes darting nervously between Zarok and the pit. "She's down there," Zarok said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "I can hear her breathing." Meera swallowed, her throat tight. The cool water lapped against her ankles, the chill seeping into her bones. She could taste the grit of the sand in her mouth, the bitter tang of blood from the cuts on her lips. "Zarakis," Solari said, her voice trembling. "Maybe we should just ask her for some water. Maybe she'll share." Zarok shot her a withering glare, his fists clenching at his sides. "She won't share," he said, his jaw tight. "Not after what I said to her, not after the way I treated her." Solari swallowed, her violent eyes flicking toward the pit. "But if we take it by force—" "We're not taking it," Zarok snapped, his voice hard as stone. "We're taking her." Meera's pulse quickened, her eyes narrowing as Zarok began to lower himself into the pit. The ground trembled beneath his weight, the stones shifting as he descended. Solari and the Venerian cadet remained at the edge, their eyes wide and fearful as they watched. Zarok's boots splashed into the water, sending ripples across the murky surface. The sound echoed through the pit, a haunting, hollow resonance that made Meera's skin prickle with dread. Zarok straightened, his chest heaving as he glared down at Meera. His face was shadowed, his eyes dark and empty. "So?" he said, his voice a low, menacing drawl. "You really thought you could outsmart me? You really thought you could keep this all to yourself?" Meera forced herself to stand, her knees shaking as she met his gaze. "I dug this pit," she said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her insides. "I found this water. You didn't do anything but threaten me and laugh." Zarok's jaw clenched, his fists flexing at his sides. "You think you're special? You think you're better than me?" He took a step forward, the water sloshing around his ankles. "You're nothing, Meera. Just a stubborn little human with a shovel and a bucket. You think that makes you a hero?" Meera's hands clenched into fists, her nails digging into her palms. "I never said I was a hero," she said, her voice cold. "But I'm not giving you anything." Zarok's eyes darkened, a muscle twitching in his jaw. "You don't have a choice," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "I'm taking what's mine." Before Meera could react, Zarok lunged at her, his massive hands wrapping around her wrists like iron manacles. The impact sent them both crashing into the water, the cold liquid splashing over Meera's face, filling her nose and mouth. She struggled against him, her feet slipping in the mud, her heart hammering in her chest. Zarok's grip was relentless, his hands squeezing her wrists with bone-crushing force. Meera kicked out, her heel connecting with his shin, but he didn't even flinch. "You're not going anywhere," Zarok snarled, his face inches from hers. "Not until you tell me where the rest of the water is." Meera gasped, the cold water burning her lungs. "There is no more," she cried, her voice breaking. "This is all of it." Zarok's eyes blazed, his teeth bared in a snarl. "Liar!" He shoved her backward, her body slamming into the wall of the pit. The stones dug into her spine, the impact knocking the air from her lungs. Meera coughed, her vision swimming as she tried to suck in a breath. Above them, Solari's voice echoed down into the pit, sharp and panicked. "Zarok, stop it! You're going to kill her!" Zarok ignored her, his hands closing around Meera's throat. "Where is it?" he growled, his breath hot against her ear. "Where is the water, Meera?" Meera's vision blurred, the edges of her world going dark. Her fingers scrabbled against Zarok's arms, her nails raking his skin, but his grip only tightened. The water sloshed around her, the sound a dull, rhythmic roar that echoed through her skull. In the distance, a loud, booming voice echoed across the desert, a voice Meera recognized instantly. "Zarok, stand down!" Instructor Veth's voice cut through the night like a whip. the authority in his tone sending a shiver down Meera's spine. Zarok's grip slackened, his eyes widening as he looked up. Above them, Veth stood at the edge of the pit, his eyes blazing with fury. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Veth roared, his face a mask of rage. "Get away from her, now!" Zarok stumbled backward, his face pale, his chest heaving. Meera slumped against the wall of the pit, her breaths coming in sharp, ragged gasps. Her throat throbbed where Zarok's hands had been, dark bruises already forming beneath her skin. Veth dropped into the pit, his boots splashing in the water as he knelt beside Meera. His eyes scanned her face, his jaw tight. "Are you all right?" Meera nodded weakly, her vision still swimming. "I'm fine," she whispered, her voice hoarse. Veth's jaw clenched, his gaze snapping to Zarok. "You are done," he said, his voice low and deadly. "You hear me? Done." Zarok swallowed, his shoulders slumping as the fight drained out of him. I was just... Veth's hand shot out, grabbing Zarok by the front of his shirt and yanking him forward. "You attacked a fellow cadet," he said, his voice cold and even. "You put her life in danger over a bucket of water. You have disgraced yourself, and you have failed this test." Zarok's eyes dropped to the ground, his jaw clenched. I'm sorry," he muttered, his voice small. Veth released him, his eyes burning with contempt. "Get out of my sight," he said, his voice a snarl. Zarok staggered backward, his face ashen. Without another word, he turned and climbed out of the pit, his footsteps heavy and slow. Veth turned back to Meera, his expression softening. "You did well, Meera," he said, his voice gentle. "Better than any of them." Meera managed a weak, weary smile. "I just did what I had to do." Veth nodded, his eyes dark with something like respect. "Sometimes, that's enough." Meera closed her eyes, the sound of the water trickling around her a soothing, steady rhythm. She had done it, she had survived, and she had proven once and for all that even in the most desolate, barren desert, there was always a way to find life.